Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Artistic Philosophy of Mirrors, Meaningful Reflections. You shall not budge, you go not till I set you up a glass, where you may see the inmost part of you. Hamlet. Hi everybody. I'd like to start, as usual, with a disturbing image. This is by a Dutch artist, MC Esher, and you'll see more of his work later on. But I thought it tied quite nicely with the Hamlet quote and the idea of seeing inside yourself. And that's going to be a major theme of today, the way in which art allows you, through its provocative and challenging use of images and mirrors, allows you to see inside yourself and to have a different frame of reference to the world around you. And I'm going to contrast that, build upon the work we did in the previous couple of videos about the notion of the double bind, and contrast art with what I'm going to suggest is the double bind of social media images and environments like Bop House, which we've looked at previously. And the idea that social media, this constant oscillation from one meaningless image to the next, and oscillation is a phrase we'll look into. I'm using it specifically. So this oscillation, the mindless, meaningless reflection. So social media, I'm going to argue, reflects the same type of image endlessly, whereas art helps you to reflect upon. So I'm looking at the notion of reflection in two different ways. So I'm going to suggest art is inherently conceptual. It makes you reflect upon. It helps you think about the frame of reference you find yourself in. So it helps you escape the double bind. Whereas social media keeps you in the double bind with this constant circularity of similar images. So that's the idea, and let's see how we get on with it. So I used this in a previous video on the double bind, and I butchered the pronunciation of the Welsh, and I checked my pronunciation with a Welsh builder I've had round recently, and it was awful, and I won't try it again because I've been traumatized. But the point of this is just simply to show you this is a single bind, what this picture represents. So let's say you found yourself in front of this road sign and it's very confusing. So basically, two options, you don't know which is best because it's impossible to tell. It's an innately confusing message. So what you do is you obviously try one, and worst case scenario, you choose the wrong option. You choose the other. But at the end of the event, you will be able to live with your choice, and you'll eventually find Llantwit Major. So that's a single bind. The bind is temporary, and it's a one-off, if it helps to think of it that way. A double bind is much more inescapable. And to the extent it can be escaped, I'm going to argue that's what art helps us do. But the double bind, just to recap for people who aren't familiar with the notion, who haven't seen the previous couple of videos, the double bind was originally came from Gregory Bateson and his work on family dynamics, and patients of his when he was working in psychiatry who showed symptoms of schizophrenia. So they're the extreme end, but he argued that the double bind represented family dynamics in all families, and when they get extreme, people can present with schizophrenic symptoms as a consequence of this dysfunctional dynamic. But the double bind is a communicational situation in which, especially when you're growing up as a kid and you can't see a way out because you're dependent upon the environment of family, you get mixed messages from a parent that are contradictory. So you can't fulfill the messages that you're getting, the requests from your parents, because they'll be contradictory. They'll go from loving to emotionally abusive or controlling, and you're just trying to tread water. And that's what a double bind is. Whatever choice you make doesn't help you escape the situation. You're just trying to survive. So I think the distinction between a single bind and a double bind is a useful one. And I'm going to argue the double bind in the family dynamic situation, and it's applicable to abusive relationships like narcissistic relationships. I'd suggest we live in a wider society where these type of mixed messages, this oscillation that happens in the double bind of confusing mixed messages, I'm going to suggest that's the environment we live in with social media and mass media. And I'll be making the links as we go along. So, just to do that, this idea of mindless oscillating reflections, and this is a key notion, reflections. So in English, you have the concept of to reflect upon, and I'm going to suggest that's what art does for us. It allows us to reflect upon, whereas social media and mass media, the way they circulate images, they're just endless repetitions. It's almost like this infinite, I was going to say labyrinth, and this talk started off, I was going to also cover the notion of the labyrinth, and I've switched to just talk about mirrors and do a whole separate video on the labyrinth because it was just too much material. But this idea of reflections as endless repetition versus reflection as the active conscious act of thinking about images, I think there's those nuances, the difference in those connotations of the word reflection are crucial. So just to give you an example of what I mean by oscillation. So I've mentioned the family dynamic and, for example, a narcissistic relationship. So the oscillation is, if you're getting conflicting messages from an emotionally abusive person, whether it's a parent or a lover, you basically are trying to keep the other person happy, and it's impossible because whatever you do isn't good enough. And you're also trying to keep your own sanity. So occasionally you will stick up for yourself, but you can't do that too much, or you risk provoking yet more threats from the abusive person in a narcissistic relationship, or you risk losing the love of a parent, which as a child is incomprehensible. You can't risk that. So you oscillate between giving in to the other person and looking after your own sanity. So that's one example of this idea of oscillation. Then Bates and Gregory Bateson, who developed this idea of the double bind, he also talks about alcoholics and the idea of they oscillate between going on the wagon or going on the bottle. And I'd be interested in the comments if you have any other derivations of being on the wagon, because I came across this as years ago. Apparently, when people were hung in the olden days in England and in London, they would be led through the streets and people would hand them drinks. And then when they got to Marble Arch, they had to get on the wagon that would take them to the scaffold. And that's when they were no longer allowed to drink. So getting on the wagon meant they were no longer drinking. So that's one version I've heard of. And a lot of these are apocryphal. So there's no way of ascertaining, what was the original, or, are these true etymologies of the phrases. But I just found that interesting. But there's another one in America when they had the temperance movement to stop people drinking. They'd go through towns banging tambourines and singing hymns, and if you got on the wagon, then you were joining the temperance movement. So I'm always fascinated by origins of phrases that are different but simultaneously could be both true from different origins. But anyway, etymological diversion there. This notion of the alcoholic oscillating between sobriety and back to going on the bottle. And I'll go into it on another occasion, but Bateson has this suggestion that it's the relationship to the oscillation. The alcoholics can sometimes feel in control. So it's oscillating from one to the other, but being part of that process gives the alcoholic sometimes a sense of control and meaning. But anyway, it's the oscillation that's interesting in this instance. And then in our economic world, the idea that the society we live in goes from boom to bust. Our economies in advanced Western societies are incredibly complicated and technologically, brilliant. And yet, market confidence It's almost like what the Romans did, horoscopy, when you look in the entrails of animals to foretell the future. That's what economists often sound like. Oh, the markets are confident. They don't know. They're just interpreting the runes. But the idea that in such modern societies we still oscillate from boom to bust. So I'm giving you examples of how in an individual family there are oscillations in this notion of the double bind, but also in wider society. So celebrities, if you think of people like, I don't know why these two came into my head, but Meghan Markle and Greta Thunberg. I hope, apologies if I've spelt Thunberg wrong. But they oscillate, that they started off, both of them, in the media eye as saints. And then over time, for some people and for certain aspects of the media, they've become sinners. So this oscillation between saint and sinner, it's a slightly bizarre, largely irrational way the tabloid media works all the time. And then you have, linked to this in the notion of celebrity, you have people, it's a tautology, people famous for being famous. Especially with the advent of reference Bop House, the idea of people who have no talent other than being famous. They're famous for being famous. It's this tautological, self-evidently true, but has no substance. You go from fame to obscurity and perhaps back again, and you oscillate between the two extremes. So that was the example I used, I think it was 2 videos ago, when I looked at the notion of the Bop House, and I interpreted it in the guise or through the prism of Jean Baudrillard's work. This idea of the endless repetition. We look at women, young women, who are making a name for themselves by being looked at for doing pornographic things. It's all about looking at, but there's no underlying... I don't think, because I was accused of being prudish by some people for daring to criticise young women doing this to themselves, for public inspection. But whether you think I'm being prudish or not, irrespective of that, there's the question. I don't think even these young ladies would claim they are artists. Perhaps they would, but you wouldn't put them in the realm of artistes. I wouldn't have thought maybe you would. Quickly moving on. So this notion of oscillating reflections versus reflection, as I've said, the constant flitting about of images compared to actively, conceptually reflecting upon the things we're looking at and listening to. So I've already spoken about the concept of the double bind, mirror images and tautologies, but I'm contrasting that with all the examples I'm about to give you, hopefully, from art in various ways will show how art allows us to question our frame of reference. So good art, in my view, is inherently enigmatic and nuanced. So I'll be giving you examples from poems, from a short story, from paintings, from sculpture. This video's got it all. And the idea is that I would suggest there is a quite profound difference between the double bind of media mirror images and art's frame of reference, and the way in which enigma and nuance allows us to escape the double bind. And hopefully, with the examples I'll give you, I'll convince you. So this social media labyrinth, like I said, I will do a whole video on the concept of the labyrinth. I've already done one video on Instagram anxiety, Instagram angst, and I used the example, the Greek mythological example of the Minotaur. But I can see really good links with the concept of modern-day trolls online, angry Minotaur-like creatures in the labyrinth of the internet. And I will do a whole new video building upon extra aspects of the Minotaur, because it's a really rich idea. But again, this is all just re-emphasising. I see art as Ariadne's thread. If you know anything about the Minotaur myth, Ariadne helps Theseus get into the maze, the labyrinth, to kill the Minotaur, who's her half-brother, by the way. and she gives him a thread, a golden thread, so he can find his way back out. And I think that's, within mythology, is a further metaphor for what mythology itself and art allows us to do, to get out of the labyrinth of the non-artistic, of the banal, of the social media labyrinth. So to give you a visual example of this, bloke in bathroom filming himself endlessly, quite cleverly, the way it just endlessly recedes. So I'm suggesting this is a great metaphor for what social media does. It endlessly recedes and repeats, but there's no actual, beyond the initial image, there's nothing new, there's nothing substantive. It's endless replication and repetition of the same. And this is from Tokyo, one of the squares in central Tokyo, apparently. I just think it's a great example of it. It's just a brilliant depiction. There's a mirror, and because it's Tokyo, there's obviously thousands and thousands of commuters. And again, I just see this as a metaphor for the fragmented. There's no central message. It's endlessly fragmented replications. And to explore all this, we're going to rely for quite a significant amount of the material in this video on Jorge Luis Borges, who I've read since I was a teenager and I've always loved. And with a Liverpool accent, it's just quite easy to say Jorge Luis Borges. It's one of the few things I'm qualified to pronounce. And his favoured themes, so I said again, labyrinths, I'll be looking at, again, using his work on the notion of the Minotaur, but he also, basically, he was fascinated all through his work. Their repeated themes are the notion of infinity, the difference in maps and the territory, and labyrinths. So I'm mostly concentrating today on the concept of infinity and how he explores that through the notion of mirrors. So there's a poem, a short poem called The Mirror, which I've done my own little translation of. It's only a very short poem, but you'll see that. There's a short story that if you'll indulge me, I'll read you, that's called The Covered Mirrors. And then there's a longer poem called Mirrors. And I'll do that at the end. And what I'm going to do is, it's not ridiculously long, but I'm going to splice that last poem with illustrated notion. So paintings and drawings that illustrate ideas in that poem. And like I said, the first one I translated, the last one I'm giving you a translation. Darren Ionesco, I think his name is, and I found he does an accompanying article that's in the description for this video, where he explains some of his translation choices. And I also reference a book called Ton Beau de Marot, which is by Douglas Hofstadter. It's a brilliant book about the act of translation. And if you have any facility with Spanish or any other language, but I'd encourage you to A, read the articles, but B, if you have any knowledge of Spanish, I'm going to give you the links to the originals and see how I've translated it, Darren's translated it, and how anyone, especially the Douglas Hofstadter book, the choices you make when making a translation, it really does teach you something about language's ability to, its protean nature. Language is just so innately slippery, and you think it's a relatively simple thing to translate a very short poem. In the Douglas Hofstadter book, Hofstadter I think it is, he gets one relatively unknown, I think it's a 16th century French poem, and he and other people translate it in different ways, and he comments upon the various translations. And it's a real eye-opener. What you think would be a relatively simple translation is anything but. And I just see similarities, and I think Borges does in all his work. Language is a key feature. And before I forget, if there's any Borges nerds out there, there is a short story called the mask and the mirror, but actually it's a bit of a red herring. The mirror in that particular story is just a prop. It's not a major feature of the short story, so I didn't include it, just in case any Borges keyboard warriors come after me, claiming I'd missed something. But anyway, so this is the Borges, and then I'll read you the poem, The Mirror, the first one, just to give an illustration of how his interpretation of the mirror for me links to these themes of the notion of infinity, the slipperiness of language, everything good about art and its enigmatic and nuanced qualities. And as I'm doing all this, please keep in the back of your mind, all of this is to be contrasted with the banality of social media. And it does what art doesn't do, or art can do what social media can never do, is a better way of expressing it. So the mirror, el espejo in Spanish, Jorge Luis Borges. I, from childhood, feared that the mirror might show me another face, or a blind, impersonal mask that would hide something, no doubt atrocious. I feared likewise that the mirror's silent time would deflect the quotidian course of man's hours and lodge in its vague imaginary horizon new beings and forms and colours. I said nothing to anyone. Children are shy. Now I fear that the mirror imprisons the true countenance of my soul, hurt by shadows and guilt, the one that God sees, and perhaps men. So to illustrate that, this is a Rene Magritte painting appropriately entitled The False Mirror. But just to go back, he had this, I know it's only a poem, but I think he did have this lifelong morbid fascination stroke fear with mirrors. And they are very odd things if you think about it. But what I'm suggesting art does that things like social media don't do is art encourages you to think beyond the obvious. It tells you to think beyond the mirror, go into the depths of the mirror and think about the significance of what a mirror really is and its relationship to reality. Whereas bop house type social media, Instagram, TikTok, all these things are based upon the constant, endless replication of the same. And we'll come back to this idea, the true countenance of my soul, hurt by shadows and guilt, the one that God sees and perhaps men. So the idea that, as with the eye at the beginning, the idea that you can see into your own soul. And remember, eyes are the windows of the soul is the phrase. And the relationship of eyes and mirrors, all these things, tie up together. But I think Magritte, what he does is have this, so the eye there is acting as a mirror in a way, a human eye wouldn't quite, there are some mirror-like aspects of the human eye, but not this extreme. But then he uses the pupil as this dark abyss. And I might have said in a previous video, I get slightly freaked out by eyes because they're just these jelly-like things, but in the mere look from someone's eye, you can see, in my case, the absolute contempt that's being reflected back to you. But I think it's quite clever the way Magritte's used the reflective nature of the iris, but then contrasted it with this deep abyss, the blackness, that you'll never know what someone, like I said, in my case, I do, but normally people are never quite sure what people are thinking of them. But even the name of this, so I've explained just briefly, some of the nuance in the iris and the pupil, but the name, the false mirror, art always tends to get you to think about the truth or the falseness or the complexity of the relationship between the true and the false. Whereas social media is normally just here you are, here you are, here you are, being shown things to look at. And there's a time and a place, so when I'm not reading depressing literature, there's nothing I like better, a bit of personal confession, but I love watching compilations of YouTube videos of people falling over. And there's a guy in the Deep South, it's all like, a lot of these are from America, but they have door cam footage, front door footage. There's a guy comes to his front door with a massive gulp cola drink and some fast food, and he opens the porch door, and I think it must be a grass snake, so he's not harmed, don't worry, but a grass snake jumps down on him, and he just starts freaking out, going, I've been bit, and he's a large bloke like myself, and he goes flying, falling over. Now that's the type of thing, priceless, great entertainment, but I hasten to add, I only watch that stuff after I've spent a day reading, quite challenging stuff. So in its place, like fast food, in moderation, none of these things do you any harm, but I'm suggesting that that's what social media tends to only do. It's a bit of a mono diet. But anyway, that's my personal confession out of the way. But I just like these. I'm now going to show you just some random. Well, they're not random in the sense they're all unified by the notion they relate to mirrors, but just artistic conceptual works that actually make you think of what mirrors are. And I'm not claiming I have the answer to what these things signify all the time, which again is what I like about art. There's an enigmatic quality, there's a nuance. Yes, art can be interpreted, but also art evokes subjectivity from people, subjective responses. It's not for me to tell you how a work of art should make you feel. But both this and the previous one, I just love the way they get. It's the solidity of the statues, the sculptures, and how they relate to the evanescence of the reflection. And then in this Michael Ayrton piece, he's literalized the idea that there's something on the other side of the mirror, but by doing that, he's also messed with how a mirror actually works. So it now looks more like a sheet of glass than a mirror, yet it's got this duplicating effect that a mirror also does. And then there's another, so this is Mirror 2 by George Tucker. There's another one, so believe it or not, I'm showing you the slightly cheerier one. There's one in which over the woman's shoulder there's a skull. So I'm taking this to mean this woman's looking, and in a sense, and over her shoulder is what she will look like in a few decades' time. So this has connotations of Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, I suppose. And I'm not. You can make your own mind up whether you think these are great pieces of art or not. But the simple point is that whether they're good pieces of art or not, they're premised upon making you think. They're problematizing the notion of just a mere reflection and offering you a completely different angle. So if you'll bear with me while I change my 15 pairs of glasses, I'll read you. It's only a very short story, but I'll read you this Covered Mirrors by Jorge Luis Borges from 1960. So here it goes, Covered Mirrors. Islam tells us that on the unappealable day of judgment, all who have perpetrated images of living things will reawaken with their works and will be ordered to blow life into them, and they will fail, and they and their works will be cast into the fires of punishment. As a child, I knew that horror of the spectral duplication or multiplication of reality, but mine would come as I stood before large mirrors. As soon as it began to grow dark outside, the constant, infallible functioning of mirrors, the way they followed my every movement, their cosmic pantomime would seem eerie to me. One of my insistent pleas to God and my guardian angel was that I not dream of mirrors. I recall clearly that I would keep one eye on them uneasily. I feared sometimes that they would begin to veer off from reality, other times that I would see my face in them disfigured by strange misfortunes. I have learnt that this horror is monstrously abroad in the world again. The story is quite simple and terribly unpleasant. In 1927, I met a young woman, first by telephone, because Julia began as a voice without a name or face, and then on a corner at nightfall. Her eyes were alarmingly large, her hair jet black and straight, her figure severe. She was the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of Federalists, as I was the grandson and great-grandson of Unitarians. But that ancient discord between our lineages was for us a bond, a fuller possession of our homeland. She lived with her family in a big run-down high-ceilinged house in the resentment and savourlessness of genteel poverty. In the afternoons, only very rarely at night, we would go out walking through our neighbourhood, which was Balvanera. We would stroll along beside the high blank wall of the railway yard. Once we walked down Sarmiento all the way to the cleared grounds of Parque Centenario. Between us, there was neither love itself nor the fiction of love. I sensed in her an intensity that was utterly unlike the intensity of eroticism, and I feared it. In order to forge an intimacy with women, one often tells them about true or apocryphal things that happened in one's youth. I must have told her at some point about my horror of mirrors, and so, in 1928, I must have planted the hallucination that was to flower in 1931. Now I have just learned that she has gone insane, and then in her room all the mirrors are covered, because she sees my reflection in them, usurping her own, and she trembles and cannot speak, and says that I am magically following her, watching her, stalking her. What dreadful bondage, the bondage of my face, or one of my former faces. Its odious fate makes me odious as well, but I don't care anymore. Well, I do the cheery ones, don't I? And what I like about Borges is, I'm not, again, just to reiterate, I'm not claiming that's, the best short story in the history of humankind, but it's the way in which he melds the banal and the day-to-day and the ordinary, the matter-of-fact tone sometimes, with just the enigmatic and the weird, the eerie, and they're juxtaposed. They all sit alongside next to each other. These quite contrasting, different atmospheres, all in the same story. It's just I don't know. I just find him pleasantly weird, if that makes sense. But the way in which his fear, his phobia gets transmitted onto the other person, and also the parallels that in any, to go back to the notion of the double bind and the family dynamic, the way in which psychological reflections, someone can become to dominate you psychologically, to such an extreme extent that, you know, you become fearful of their reflection in a mirror, that you begin to hallucinate that you see. So there's levels of complexity about the psychology, about the misleadingly simple notion of a mirror that Borges brings out. And then there's the Jewish tradition in when you're sitting Shiva, all the mirrors in the house are covered up for various reasons. I think one of them is you're not supposed to be worried about yourself and how you might look. You're supposed to be concentrating on paying respects to the dead. And I'm giving short shrift. I think there are more reasons in the Jewish tradition. But this idea in various cultures, mirrors have a, you know, quite a complex cultural role. So anyway, that was Borges and covered mirrors. And this I've referred to in previous videos, but the concept of the Ouroboros, the notion that the snake eating its own tail. I'm going to give you a brief quote from Ovid's Metamorphoses in a second, the Narcissus thing that I've often referred to. And I think there's a collection called After Ovid, which Hughes, the poet, Sylvia Plath's husband, he produced or edited and contributed to, I think. There was a collection of modern interpretations of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I'm remembering in the foreword, the introduction, the editors described how Ovid's original tales are like a snake eating itself. And I really encourage you, if you get the chance, just check out Ovid's Metamorphoses, and you get this real sense of tales eating tales in the terms of tales as in stories, not just a snake's tail. They're very, you know, as the name would imply, metamorphoses, they're incredibly changeable, and serpents do appear at various stages in the Metamorphoses. But this you've seen lots of times before. I understand I might be accused of borderline fixation on this Caravaggio painting of Narcissus. But I do think I just can never fail to see the relevance of this to people who spend an inordinate amount of their time online rather than in the real world, which I accept as always ironic since this talk is taking place on a YouTube channel. But nevertheless, hypocritical, moi. So this is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And so Tiresias, famous through all Ionian towns and cities, gave irreproachable answers to all comers who sought his guidance. One of the first who tested the truth that he told was a naiad of the river Liriope, whom the river god... was a naiad of the river Liriope, whom the river god Cephissus embraced and ravished in his watery dwelling. In time she bore a child, most beautiful even as a child, gave him the name Narcissus, and asked Tiresias if the boy would ever live to a ripe old age. Tiresias answered, yes, if he never knows himself. How silly those words seemed, for how long? But as it happened, time proved them true. The way he died, the strangeness of his infatuation. And those wacky Romans, because when Ovid's writing this, there's a bit of a pun or a bit of a joke when Tiresias says, yes, if he never knows himself. Remember the three axioms of the sayings at the Delphic oracle were know thyself, nothing to excess, and they debate the third one, its true meaning, but something along the lines of surety or certainty leads to ruin. So the injunction was to know yourself, whereas they're making fun of this. There's an illusion, yes, if he never knows himself. But the difference is, I think the Delphic oracle's telling you to get to know yourself, which should be a lifelong project. what Narcissus does wrong is thinking he knows himself merely through a reflection. And you should be picking up on, from my sardonic tone of voice, yet again, I see this as having relevance to social media, in which, as I said at the beginning, I distinguished between the notions of reflection. Narcissus is looking at his pale reflection. And that is what social media provides us with compared to art. And social media misleadingly makes us think we know ourselves and others, when the point about the Delphic Oracle, know thyself, was that you never truly know yourself. As human beings, we're always living in the past, present, and future simultaneously. And that is the intractability of the human condition. It's not easy to do. Whereas Narcissus has reduced everything down to an eternal now. No past, no future, just this obsessive looking at himself. So, an excerpt from Julius Caesar. Cassius says, "Tell me, good Brutus, can you see your face?" "No, Cassius, for the eye sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other things." "'Tis just, and it is very much lamented, Brutus, that you have no such mirrors as will turn your hidden worthiness into your eye, that you might see your shadow." So this is just picking up for me on the image I started off with, the disturbing image of the eye from Esher. But I think it's why Shakespeare is such a genius, his psychological insight. "It is very much lamented, Brutus, that you have no such mirrors as will turn your hidden worthiness into your eye, that you might see your shadow." So you could put this in direct opposition to Narcissus looking at his own mere reflection. Cassius is telling Brutus it's a shame he can't see his own shadow, his soul. And this is what Borges is referring to earlier. This fear that in mirror, what a mirror can do, if you're paying proper attention to yourself, is reveal something deep within you. And I'd suggest only the mirror of art truly does that. And in the video I did on Gregory Bates and the playful art of signals with the two jackdaws on the front, I quoted, it's one of my favourite quotes, "The play's the thing, wherein we'll catch the conscience of the king." So from Hamlet, and in this particular scene, there's this, he's speaking to his friends, and the idea, it's about acting when he creates the play within the play. The purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold, as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. So to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, as opposed to Narcissus and modern social media, glorifying and reveling and celebrating in their own image. But the idea that art, or in this case the play, and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure. So for Hamlet, that's what a play or drama can do. It can capture the zeitgeist. So he's trying to pressure the king into recognizing his own guilt. But arguably the wider purpose of art is to capture the zeitgeist we live in. Despite all the manic activity, good art actually shows you the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure, and is to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature. So art has this unique ability, not just to simply reflect nature back to itself, but to go deeper down in the second stanza, to show virtue her own feature. And then to bring this away from Shakespeare and into psychology, I want to show and again in a future video I'm going to do a whole session on the notion of framing, and interpreted completely literally, the actual way in which frames on paintings are actually quite important, which maybe isn't something we often think about. But there are some brilliant people, artists, who used frames in a particular way. But in this is the basis of paradox. So if you notice here, all statements within this frame are untrue. But then all you have to do to make this paradoxical is put the overarching statement that was outside the frame inside the frame. So the minute you do this, all statements within this frame are untrue. That statement itself starts to refer to itself. So you begin to ask, not just, are the phrases, I love you and I hate you, are they true? You then began to ask, well, what's the relationship of the truth of those statements to the truth of the other statement within the frame? And you get into this never-ending circularity, this paradox. And I think this is what art does so brilliantly. So I'm giving you just a verbal, this is how paradox arises. When that first phrase is outside the frame, there's no contradiction, there's no paradox. But this relates to, say, the paradox of the Epimenides, I think it was, when he says all Cretans are liars, but Epimenides was a Cretan. So if he's a Cretan and all Cretans are liars, can you trust what he's just said? Just like that statement within the frame, how it relates to the other phrases may make that statement true or false. And if it's false, then because all statements within this frame are untrue, if it's false, it's true, and if it's true, it's false. You get into this ridiculous paradox that doesn't make any sense. But what art does, I'd suggest, is make this paradox more manageable and gives it an aesthetic form. So I want to get away from this, because the point about paradox is it can't be solved and it's not easy to explain, because that's the point of paradox. But more optimistically, this is another Esher picture. And I just like the way he plays with the concept of sky and water and gets you to think of the framing. Black and white, sky and water, fish and fowl. And Escher does this type of stuff all the time, and I like the way he uses not just mirrors but spheres to make it really brings to the fore the notion of reality and how we relate to reality and how we frame it. So this reiterates what I was trying to, or encapsulates what I was talking about earlier on, the way in which art makes you reflect upon reflections. It's like a meta reflective medium. You don't just see the image unproblematically. Good art makes you think about what you're looking at. I like this because it's so misleadingly simple. It's getting you to question the concept of a sphere. and the way in which he gives the appearance of a sphere within a building complex, as if this was being looked at through some type of sphere. But the way in which Escher always approaches reality is in a slightly confusing, discombobulating, reframing type way. And then I'm going to develop in future, I want to pay a lot more attention to the concept of metaphors and language. So I've been giving you quite a few visual examples, but just in terms of language itself, the way in which something as simple as punctuation, how you punctuate sentences either with the stress of your voice or actual grammatical punctuation, and more metaphorically how art is punctuated, has a profound effect. So what is a question that is also its own answer? Why not? Why not? Why not? Why not? It's now we're getting into Samuel Beckett territory. But if you can follow that through, it just creates almost manic dialogue just by changing the punctuation slightly. You know, the punctuation and the emphasis have a profound effect on meaning. And I like this next one because it also emphasizes the role of emphasis. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like a banana. And there's someone I know, I had to explain this to, but I won't say who it was. If you hadn't noticed it, fruit flies could be the fruit flying like an arrow, or the entity known as fruit flies, little insects. And that obviously profoundly affects the meaning of the sentence. But we'll get into it in a future day in much more detail. This is the point of language, and this relates to the point I was making about translation. Language is so slippery, language is so innately lending itself to misunderstanding or productive misunderstanding. So the fact that fruit flies like a banana can be interpreted two ways is what gives language its richness. So you can't just reflect back in a passive way like media images. When you're talking with someone at any decent level, the nuances and the ambiguities are baked into the language. And that, or in works of literature, that's what makes them open to interpretation and more than mere passive reflections. And to go back to visual examples, The Treachery of Images, this is from, I think we'll see in a second if I'm wrong, but 1929, Rene Magritte. This is not a pipe. And what Magritte's done brilliantly here is he's combined the representation with the statement to maximise the ambiguity. So just to illustrate that. These are the various things you could say that this means. So this pipe is not a pipe. This image of a pipe is not a pipe. This painting is not a pipe. This sentence is not a pipe. This, the word this, is not a pipe. And this is not a pipe, meaning all those things combined is not a pipe. And this is the levels of representation that Magritte played on in his art. So another example would be this. La condition humaine. So as you can see, he's put an easel directly in front of, as you'll see in the quotation to come, contiguous with, just meaning directly in front of, so it matches perfectly the outside scene. Magritte presents what might be called the paradox of the realistic painter. By making the representation of the easel exactly contiguous with the representation of the real world, Magritte plunges us into paradox. Magritte said of this picture, "In front of a window, as seen from the interior of a room, I placed a picture that represented precisely the portion of landscape blotted out by the picture. For instance, the tree represented in the picture displaced the tree situated behind it, outside the room. For the spectator, it was simultaneously inside the room, inside the picture, and outside in the real landscape, in thought." And I'd suggest this is just a really common feature of Magritte's work, that the inside and the outside are constantly being framed, literally in this case. There's the frame of the picture frame itself, there's the frame of the casement of the window, that then shows you the reproduction, the replication of another building behind that. So it's always frames within frames within frames, other windows with Magritte. So what I'll do now is, I'm going to sum up, but it's a bit more complicated than that. I'm going to read you the poem Mirrors by Borges. It's not that long, but I'm going to intersperse a couple of verses each time with an image that I think illustrates to some extent. And there won't be a perfect match, because the point is a poem and paintings are never going to be, to quote Magritte, contiguous with each other. But I'd just be interested in the comments whether you think it works, the idea. I'm going to show you images that I think have relevance to the sentiment being expressed in the poem. And hopefully the combined, the sum is greater, so the result is greater than the sum of its parts. And maybe it'll just be a complete flop, but we will see. So Mirrors by Jorge Luis Borges. I who sense in mirrors an inherent doom, not only before the impenetrable glass, within whose unhabitable limits pass reflections within an impossible room, but before the specular water that imitates the other blue within its bottomless height, which is sometimes streaked with the illusory flight of an inverted bird, or which a ripple agitates. Or before the silent superficial repose of a subtle ebony whose smooth face may reflect as in a dream the white trace of a vague marble or of a vague rose. Today, after so many a perplexing year of wandering under the varying moon, I wonder what accident of fortune has made the mirror to me a source of such fear. Mirrors of metal, and also the mirror concealed as mahogany which in the haze of its red crepuscule blurs the gaze of the face that both sees it and is in it revealed. I see them as infinite, substratal, executors of an ancient pact to multiply the world like the act of generation, sleepless and fatal. They prolong this vain, uncertain world with thread in whose vertiginous web we are shrouded. Sometimes in the evening they become clouded by the breath of a man who is not yet dead. The glass lies in wait for us, if among the four walls of my room a mirror is mounted there. I am not alone, there is another, the reflected glare, which in the dawn assembles a secret stage floor. Everything happens, but nothing is preserved in those cabinets, crystalline synagogues, where, like fantastical rabbi pedagogues, we read books from right to left while observed. Claudius, king of an evening, a royal dreaming, did not sense he was unreal until that day when an actor mimed his crime within a play, in silent art, reversing being and seeming. That there are dreams, that there are mirrors, is strange. That the normal and worn-out routines of each day include this illusory, deep world of display, woven of reflections laid out in a range. God puts an effort, I have begun to deem, into all that architectural ambiguity which forges light out of the continuity of the glass and shadow out of the dream. God has created nights in an armed parade of dreams and of shapes in replication, so that man may sense he himself is imitation and vanity. It is of this that we are afraid. Until the next time, all the very best.